what we're trying to do is find some holes in our existing knowledge about the relationship between congestion and economic growth, and we'll probably be commissioning a number of independent research. We can see now with the state of knowledge that we have what some options might be. And I'm hoping that this will feed very well into what Peter's going to say with a lot more depth, and as well as Ron. Hopefully it'll be a really nice complement to that. First of all, one of the things we've been doing is we've been consulting a lot of experts on the issue of congestion transportation. Some of you may know that Bob Poole, who was a former president of Reason Foundation, founder of Reason Foundation, now director of transportation studies, has been looking at things like toll roads for quite a while as a way of managing congestion, as well as other transportation options. We also have Ted Balaker, who is a transportation analyst. I don't think he's in this room. But anyway, we're trying to develop, and we have some capability on this issue. But now what we're trying to do is really pull it together, because we kind of got sick and tired of people saying that we can't do anything about congestion when we know we can. And in fact, I think what we've found in pulling some of these experts together and talking to them is that we have a whole lot more tools than people are willing to recognize. And so the question is pulling it together and trying to get it out as part of an agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. Toward the end of this discussion. First thing, though, I think it's always useful to talk a little bit about the congestion problem. And by the way, I forget who it was that said that there's maybe it was Rob who talked about how for some people congestion is not a problem. It's actually very interesting. What we've been finding is now we've talked to in depth probably about 2 or 3 dozen people. Highway and engineering people say congestion seems to recognize that congestion is a problem and think we can do something about it. Planners, on the other hand, don't really see congestion as a problem. So there's sort of an interesting attitude toward it, because on one hand, we've got Tony Downs, who's not really a planner, but he's a political scientist, who basically just sort of throws his hands up and say congestion is part of life, so deal with it. But then you have another group of largely academics, but also urban planners that say, well, congestion actually has benefits, which we should sort of embrace, and some of the consequences of that are increasing transit use, more walking and bicycling and that type of thing. So don't look at congestion as purely a cost. But the problem that we run into is that I think we're getting to, at least I'm getting to, in looking at the research and looking at how people react to this, is that congestion is a real issue to people, and to people when they're in their cars and they're stuck in traffic. But where we're seeing the consequences, and unfortunately there's not a lot of research on this, but is in the decisions that businesses make about where to locate and expand. We're finding, in fact, some work by David Hartkin at University of North Carolina, some consultants, Cambridge Systematics and Glenn Ricebrod, are showing that by congestion increasing the cost of doing business, you're shifting investment, not only within a metropolitan area, but among metropolitan areas. So right now we're actually trying to figure out if there's a way we can quantify that we can actually show that. But it's surprisingly, we've been focusing so much on the residential commuter, we haven't been looking at the impact on production and goods movement. And so that's actually an area of knowledge. But from what we do know is that congestion, at least as we deal with it in terms of commuters, is rising in every major metropolitan area. And it does vary significantly. And what I think the Texas Transportation Institute data show that it's rising. And while there are lots of disputes about whether or not it's a methodologically sound index or the way they're measuring it, the truth is it's still, I think, the best information we have out there. And we find that it really varies quite significantly from Los Angeles, where Reason's offices look right over the 405, which is a major north-south. And I'm from the Midwest. I actually live in Ohio. And in Dayton, Ohio, we've kind of taken the Detroit approach to congestion. You just see your economy go in the tank, and then traffic just goes down, so you don't have to worry about it. So I sort of, when I'm at the Reason offices, I sort of look out over the 405, and I'm thankful that technology allows me to work out of my home in Ohio. But nevertheless, mid-sized cities like Cincinnati and Columbus, you're seeing congestion increase significantly, and it's beginning to alter where people live and where businesses work. But we can't, most metropolitan areas are not faced with the congestion of a Los Angeles or even a Houston. or Dallas. In fact, most of the time we're talking about congestion around peak hours and not throughout the entire day. But what's interesting in this, well, this might explain part of it, few cities or metropolitan areas are actually addressing the problem directly. Notably, I think some exceptions are Texas, which is really engaging in a state level attention to this, but also, although I may not agree with the choices or the policy decisions, Portland, Oregon has at least said they're trying to address it. And while they are experiencing some of the fastest growing congestion as they've been investing in light rail and transit, at least they say they're trying to address it comprehensively. And what we're also discovering is that no city appears to be addressing congestion relief in a comprehensive way. Most of the time it's ad hoc. Solutions are often narrow, very focused, either hot lanes, which are high occupancy toll lanes, or in Portland's case, transit. Again, Portland, at least, though they're trying to take this comprehensive land use planning approach, it is centered around transportation. So I'm not endorsing their approach, which would probably get me thrown out of this room, but nevertheless, if you want to look at decision making and how it fits in within a traditional planning model, Portland's not a bad place to start. So there is then the question is question a problem? I mentioned this before. A lot of land use planners really don't think it's a problem. Pro-transit advocates don't think it's a problem because they just look at that as another way to get people into buses and on light rail lines. And anti-sprawl special interest groups don't think congestion is a problem because they just want to stop the outward expansion of cities. Whereas the people that do think it is are commuters, businesses, and at times elected officials. But they often throw up their hands as well. Now, in terms of, so I'm going to start from the assumption that it's yes, in main large part because our entire project sort of hinges on the fact that we think congestion is a problem. And I think that there's also a fair amount of evidence to suggest that this is changing the way our metropolitan economies work. And I think we need to really understand it at a minimum. But I also think that the more time we waste stuck in traffic, that's lost productivity. So I think there are good economic reasons to worry about this as well. But it also means that if we're tackling it, whether we're in Dayton, Ohio, where we do have a little bit of a congestion, or near Los Angeles, or you're from Los Angeles, we have to better understanding what drives congestion. And I think this is, and part of that, and some of that's framing the way we're looking at this issue, is that you can look at congestion as either recurrent or non-recurrent. And the non-recurrent, it would be things like accidents, construction, things that are one-time occurrences that would not necessarily continue day after day, whereas recurrent is most normally what you see on the 405, which is just slow traffic because you've got too little capacity and too many people trying to get on those roads. Now, and importantly, it's important to separate this because your strategies for dealing with congestion will differ significantly based on how much of that traffic is recurrent and how much of it isn't. And I'll get into that here in a few minutes. Also, I think it's useful to sort of look at why we drive. Generally speaking, and this does vary significantly from state to state, but most of the road miles, in other words, the actual roads that we surface, are local roads. A lot of times we don't think of that because we think of congestion in all the pictures and our images, and also often when we're stuck in traffic, are on freeways. And we're sort of in that commute, either suburb to downtown, or actually, 2/3 of the time it's suburb to suburb, doing on a beltway or something like that. And
is the freeways the lane miles or just total miles?
that is
It's
total miles. That's total miles. Yeah, and that's a good that's a good point. It's not lane miles.
Could easily make that much bigger.
Yeah.
It could make it much bigger, but it not to the point where I think we shift our focus. In other words, we need to recognize that when we're looking at the transportation infrastructure, in terms of what we're maintaining and operating, and what states and counties are investing in, most of that investment is going into building local roads more incrementally than what we see in freeways. But that's really where a lot of that investment goes. In fact, some of the work I've been looking at in Ohio, we found that there's been virtually no, over the last 10 years, been no investment in freeways, but huge investments in locals and arterials and collectors. And because that's servicing a lot of the growth, because a lot of the growth is spreading out in most metropolitan areas as well. So very good point, though. Thanks.
Lane miles, not center line.
Right. Also, where we drive is important as well, because even though freeways make up a small part of the basic physical infrastructure, that's where most of our VMT ends up going. Spend a lot of it on local roads, but a lot of those local roads are small, they can't handle a lot of volume, and the arterials are also very important. So in terms of where we're looking at bottlenecks and where we're looking at traffic, that changes the way we look at this as well. So we're investing a lot in our local miles. We need to recognize that most people are on the freeways, and most people are putting the miles on our car in the arterials. So what are the implications for this? Freeways shoulder most of the burden for travel demand, because a lot of times that traffic on arterials and collectors is actually trying to get people to those freeways as well for the longer commutes. I'm not sure I'm not, okay. Most of the investment is local roads and arterials, but I think the more important point here is that strategies need to be targeted. You need to recognize where your bottlenecks are and where the congestion is, and to design your strategy for dealing with congestion that way. Should be no metropolitan area has checked congestion growth without building new road capacity. You may have seen the Texas Transportation Institute study being used a lot, because they talk in there. There's a fairly large section about transportation, or transit, public transit, and how many cars are taken off the road, quote unquote, by public transit. Well, what is very often not reported is the fact that it's very clear in that report that the only metro areas that have been making any inroads into this have been adding capacity. And if you're not adding capacity to match the growth of your metropolitan area, you're falling further and further behind. I think that what that means is somehow you've got to deal with that issue of capacity, and you can't just ignore it, and certainly you can't think that transit's going to take care of it. So what are some ways you can address non-freeway congestion? Well, there is expanding capacity. You actually widen roads. Actually, it's where, there we go. Adding widenings, adding new roads. Also, something we don't focus on very often is better design. We sort of need to remember that as our metropolitan areas expand and grow and densify, you have to think about redesigning or trying to configure the intersections better. You can also begin talking about or considering what are called intelligent transportation systems. And these are simply ways of trying to use your infrastructure, your road infrastructure, more efficiently. And you can do that by using traffic signal coordination, so that you actually time the traffic lights so that they occur at intervals that keep cars moving at a faster flow. And there have been some notable reductions in delay once that has been done. Actually, Columbus, Ohio has been in the forefront of that, as we've found out in our research. Incident management, I think it was Los Angeles. What they started to do is figure out if you had an accident, what you do is you pull the cars off to the side of the road so the traffic can keep flowing, and then you handle the incident reports and the traffic reports off on the median. And that actually has had significant impact, although sometimes it's hard to see. Actually, that's a bullet from another presentation, so sorry about that. That's what happens when you're trying to clean something up on midnight on a plane to a conference. Also, there are limited roles for demand management. I think this is important when we're talking about non-freeway. What I mean by non-freeway is when you're talking about collectors and arterials, not limited access highways where you have exits and dedicated lanes for exits. Demand management, and what I mean by demand management is things like using road pricing as a way to change incentives about when people use roads at certain times. But while it may have a limited role in arterials and collectors, it has I think it's a really important role in the area of freeway congestion. What's this corner? Back up again. I'll just do that. Freeway congestion, you can still use ITS, incident management, motorist information, ramp metering. All those have been used with varying degrees of success. And interestingly enough, John Simmons, I don't know if he's in here, but at the Arizona Department of Transportation, did a really neat analysis of the relative cost effectiveness of different techniques. And I think it's available online. And if you're interested, I can get it. But it actually showed how these things could be effective in terms of reducing reducing congestion, improving flows in a very cost-effective way, sort of low cost. Although on any individual one of these may not have a substantial impact in and of itself. So putting it in a coordinated approach to managing traffic can be very helpful. Also, aggressive demand and some of these can be done fairly in short term. What I mean by short term is in less than 5 years. A lot of times the technology exists. It's a question of just getting it on the priority, getting local officials to recognize what the value is, putting a plan in place and getting it funded. Also, though, you can work in a more intermediate term, and there's a bit of a debate about whether this is intermediate, short, or long term. Using aggressive demand management, I'm sort of putting in here tolling, variable rate tolling, congestion pricing, hot lanes, which are high occupancy toll lanes, that's converting HOV lanes to toll lanes where you allow single occupant vehicles to get onto those lanes to use since they are underutilized, but they have to charge money, you have to charge a toll. And where they've been used in California and elsewhere, they've actually been very successful. Got a great story of, and the tolls can either be just single charges or better, that's variable rate. In other words, you increase it in order to manage flow. So the more congested the road is, you raise the rate. And you can do this in real time. Technology allows you to do it in real time. In other words, I think it may be I-90, 91, what?
Are we doing that here in town in Minneapolis on 394?
Yes.
Are you?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Every 3 minutes?
Every 3 minutes?
Someone said that to me the other
Wow.
day.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
on 294, it's every 3 minutes.
Yeah, that-
So it's
yeah.
just-
Peter will be able to talk about this in a lot more depth, so I won't spend too much time, other than simply to relate an example I just heard the other day. Actually, it was in a meeting that Peter was in, where John Ramirez, who was the executive director of the 91, got a call from his mother, if I remember, and called him saying, "Look, I just paid $7.50 to get on this expressway. Don't you think that's excessive?" And John said, "Well, Mom, do you see that the lane next to you?" She said, "Oh, the one with all those people going slow?" He said, "Yes." And she said, "I see the point." She was able to go fast and get where she needed because they were able to manage it through tolls, and it was very effective. But anyway, so hot lanes, congestion pricing. Also, an important advantage of this is that it's self-financing in the sense that you can, in many cases, particularly in very congested areas, you can actually find the revenue to build capacity by using tolls. A very, very important strategic role for tolling in this debate. Also, adding new capacity is possible in the long run, but this is real long run. We're talking about 10 years down the road, 10, 20 years. But we have not only new road capacity we can financially toll, but we're talking about stacking, putting lanes on top of each other, talking about tunneling. These are all options that can be part of a comprehensive strategy for addressing congestion. And the technology exists to do them. And in fact, all of these are in place somewhere in the world. And that's, I think we started this project thinking that we might actually have to do a lot of research about what is possible. And what we found out very quickly as we initiated this project is that in many cases the technology already exists. What is lacking is a political will or fully understanding what the application would be in a U.S. context. So there are literally dozens of possibilities, and this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that you could look at. But I think the idea of understanding what part of congestion you're trying to address, recurrent, non-recurrent, whether you're thinking short-term, long-term, whether you're talking about local and arterial versus freeway, are very important ways of breaking down the problem, and then you can come up with almost a matrix of solutions based along those major areas. What will not work, expanded public transit, too little flexibility. Public transit riders commute longer than automobile riders. I always find that very interesting. The assumption is that somehow you get people on buses and trains, you're going to get to where you want faster. Typically it's 40, 50%, sometimes double the time. Densities are not high enough outside Chicago and New York, and some even question that. Regional land use planning won't work. I think the research is pretty clear that jobs housing balance, somehow using planning to balance it out, is pretty much, there's just research isn't there. Concentrating employment growth, little evidence that any of this stuff works. Actually, Tony Downs' book, Stuck in Traffic, does a great overview of these issues as well. So in short, and I'll close out here because I'm at my 20 minutes. Next steps, public education. I think that's a huge part of what we're focused on. We've heard so much the mantra that you can't build your way out of congestion, that too many people believe it. And simply presenting these options, and sometimes a short, brief conversation with an elected official or even your neighbor, opens up entire new doors and entirely new ways of thinking about how you deal with traffic congestion in your metropolitan area. Also, that means this is an area where I think we need to be thinking regionally, not just locally. It's not just a question of your local town. This is part of a network of roads that feeds into the entire regional economy. Strategies, think in terms of strategies, demand management through pricing, flexible land development, I think has a role here. I'm actually, although I may find myself questioning this after we do a little more research and do analysis, but I think by allowing land to conform more to what actual needs are in terms of businesses as well as commutes, there are some benefits we can get on the margin from higher density and to some extent mixed use. Of course, I may be a bit biased since I'm a telecommuter. Actually, I'm not a telecommuter. I just work out of my, I don't really have a place that I work. I just work out of my home and touch base with corporate HQ in Los Angeles every once in a while. And coalition building. Wouldn't underestimate coalitions you can develop of all sorts of different interests. Clearly, and actually what's been interesting for me in working on the transportation side, even though I'm a land use guy for the past 10 years, is how often I can actually get into a civil conversation with Sierra Club members when we're talking about ways of managing demand through tolls. Now, not all of them. I mean, they still think of me as the devil. Actually, they tell me I'm the devil. But nevertheless, there are the more pragmatic interest groups and people that are involved in those interest groups. You can start a conversation and it can be productive. And in fact, I am convinced that transportation and congestion is a pragmatic issue for the vast majority of people. It is not ideological, and I don't find thinking about who will support one strategy or another in partisan terms has ever been very effective or either effective or useful in terms of figuring out how we move towards a strategy. One of the biggest advocates for congestion pricing in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a rising problem of congestion, is in fact a Democrat. So the question is, you've got a problem to solve, you've got practical solutions, you can really build coalitions across a wide variety of groups and try to avoid using ideological or partisan lenses for figuring out who's going to be potentially helpful in solving this problem. And with that, I'm done.